Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today I wanted to outline a build that I'm thinking of possibly league starting in the 3.13 expansion, and that is an Elementalist that is based around the new Shaper of Flames node. The Shaper of Flames does three things, all of which are important. The third line is just pure more damage, but it does require you to deal a lot of fire damage. That one's important to the build, but we'll leave that aside because it's not anything that's mechanically different. It's just something that makes you better at what you'd otherwise be doing. But your hits always ignite. This basically sets your chance to ignite with skills to 100%, rather than being 0% by base as it normally is, with 100% on crits. So this means that you can ignite with non-crits reliably. But then there's the big line. All damage with hits can ignite. This is a huge change. Normally in Path of Exile, physical damage can never ignite. Lightning damage can only ignite through the use of a couple of unique items, such as the unique Ring Stormfire. Cold damage can only ignite with the use of a couple of uniques, such as the Gloves Hrimburn. And Chaos damage can only ignite, as far as I'm aware, with Zerfi's Heart, a necklace that you can pick up late in the game. So all of these were gated behind very rare uniques. Now, Harimburn's usually pretty easy to pick up in a trade league, and so is Stormfire, but they are genuinely rare items. Shaper of Flames gives this power to the Elementalist in general. You can make all of your damage ignite, and that is something that plays very well with skills that do a very large amount of damage, potentially of multiple elements. So, what is there that deals a lot of damage with multiple elements? The first thing that comes to mind is Discharge. The second thing that comes to mind is Divine Ire. And this build is around Divine Ire because it's a little bit easier to set up. Now, I will state that this build is heavily influenced by a build that was posted to the Path of Exile builds subreddit over on Reddit, and I will put a link to that below. That build was created by Nork the Orc, and I have made a number of changes to it, but fundamentally it is Nork's build with my adjustments rather than my build influenced by Nork's work. So definitely have a look there as well. Nork has his own ideas and is definitely worth checking out because he knows his stuff. The rest of the Ascendancy, we're taking Mastermind of Discord to debuff enemy fire resistance further. We're taking Heart of Destruction for AoE when we don't need damage, and damage when we do need damage. And we're taking Bastion of Elements for some protection from enemy elemental damage, and for outright immunity to reflected elemental damage, which is really important on a Divine Ire build. So, in terms of the core passive tree, there's a few things that need to be pointed out. Just going through all of the keystones we're taking. Unwavering Stance is an interesting one. Often associated with Cyclone builds, Unwavering Stance is very important on this build. It's very important because Divine Ire is a standstill, charge up my laser, and then unleash hell build. And unfortunately, you can't do that if you're getting stunned often. There's a few other options you could take. You could conceivably spend 1, 2, 3 points to take the Practical Application cluster. That would give you 55% chance to avoid interruption with stuns while casting. And then you could also take Lucidity, which you could either anoint or pick up just through the normal pathing to it on the passive tree. Lucidity, and that will give you a total of 95% immunity to stun while you're actively channeling. So that would be an option too. However, Nork's decision was to go with the Unwavering Stance approach, and I think that's a pretty sensible one. It spends less points. It's really only a 2-point investment because you kind of want the Arsonist cluster anyway. And in fact, there's a very important node in the Arsonist cluster, which is not a notable. So let's just quickly make a diversion to talk about weapon fire damage. This is essential despite not looking it. That's because with 20% of physical damage converted to fire damage, this does two things. Firstly, it makes it so that your Wave of Conviction goes from usually doing mostly fire damage and sometimes mostly lightning to always doing mostly fire damage. So that means that Wave of Conviction will inflict fire exposure every time, rather than being sort of fire exposure 85% of the time, lightning exposure 15% of the time or so. So that means that your Wave of Conviction is more reliable. The second reason, and more importantly, is that it causes your Divine Ire to do more fire damage than it does lightning damage, in order to make Shaper of Flames more reliable. Again, Shaper of Flames, that third line on it is good, and it's worth taking this node. That is despite Path of Building actually saying that removing this node increases the character's damage. That is wrong. Oh well, it's correct in terms of it's calculated correctly, but it doesn't match the reality of the game. Okay, so in terms of other defensive layers, we're taking the Agnostic as a keystone. This is one of those nodes that transforms the way that your build defends itself. Normally, one of the ways that you tend to get killed on characters is by taking a lot of small hits in a short period of time. The Agnostic doesn't give you total immunity to those small hits, but sort of feels pretty close. You have a life regeneration rate of 854 with the Agnostic. Without it, you have 191. So this is giving you a tremendous amount of life recovery. It does so at the expense of you having absolutely no energy shield, and when you're not at full life, it burns your mana really fast to recover life. You are going to need to recover that mana via various means, and we're going to be using a mana flask to do that, as well as investing in things like Shaper here on the passive tree. We're taking Elemental Equilibrium. This allows you to use Stormbrand to debuff tough bosses. Now, I suggest that you do not take Elemental Equilibrium until you are ready to face bosses that are like the Shaper, that sort of upper tier of map bosses, and the Shaper and the Elder. That's when you're going to start wanting to look at getting Elemental Equilibrium, because ultimately this decreases the combination of Elemental Equilibrium and Stormbrand that we're going to use will decrease your damage against trash mobs, but tremendously amp it up against tough bosses. And ultimately, when you get to the end game, you will struggle more with dealing damage to tough bosses. That'll be more urgent. So you're going to want Elemental Equilibrium at that point. What you're doing here is you are casting a skill, Stormbrand, that hits enemies rapidly, and you can use Ball Lightning if you prefer Ball Lightning to Stormbrand. Either of these will do the job. This will frequently hit enemies, inflicting only lightning damage on them. While it's doing this, you're going to be hitting that enemy with your Divine Ire, and when you do that, Divine Ire is going to do two things. Firstly, it's going to deal an initial hit that's going to deal lightning damage and fire damage. Then it's going to leave a burn on the enemy, dealing pure fire damage. Initially, Elemental Equilibrium is going to actually protect that enemy partially from the fire damage. But then, once Stormbrand ticks, and the enemy will start getting 50% less resistance, 50% reduced resistance to fire, and at that point, it will start taking a lot more damage. It will start taking a lot more damage per second. You'll see both by looking at the total damage per ignite and the ignite DPS that Elemental Equilibrium, despite being clunky, it's a big multiplier for damage. Next up, we have Elemental Overload, which removes your ability to scale damage through crits, but also causes you to have 40% more elemental damage, which includes 40% more burning damage if you've dealt a crit recently. This is just really good. You have to take it. It's so good on a build like this. We're also going to be taking Mind Over Matter while leveling, and then we're going to drop it when we get our endgame armor. Our endgame armor being the Cloak of Defiance. Cloak of Defiance is really good. Defensively, it is going to provide you with a mana, sorry, pun not intended. It is going to provide you with a mana of protecting yourself indirectly and using your mana reserves as sort of a second indirect life pool. In terms of itemization, this is a bunch of bad crafted gear that's been set up mostly. That was set up by Nork the Orc. The only things here that are particularly good, you've got this Cerulean Ring, which has curses enemies with flammability on hit. That's a pretty good item to have. You'll need a Warlord Influence Cerulean Ring for this to be as good as possible. Doesn't need to be a Cerulean Ring early on though. Cerulean Ring will make your character more powerful, but isn't needed. We've got Essence Worm, which is in hot demand early on. Until you get this, I don't think you can really use an aura, and using Malevolence, the aura, is really strong, so you're definitely going to want to get that. Otherwise, though, everything's pretty basic. Taste of Hate is a hard flask to come by early on. Cinder Swallow Urn is a hard flask to come by early on. But guess what? The most important flask is Atziri's Promise. It adds more damage than either of the other two, so it's the priority, and then you can get the other two when you can. You'll see that once we turn on all three flasks, you're looking at a DPS of 3.4 million with this setup, and then when you turn them all off, you're dealing a full 35% less damage than that. So those flasks are really good, but get them when you can get them. In terms of high-end upgrades, a Watcher's Eye that has Malevolence mods is fantastic. And also, there are a couple of new crafting bases. The Blizzard helmet is incredible, and you are definitely going to want to be using a Blizzard helmet on this build. That's something that you'll be able to find in-game. We don't know how rare they're going to be, but they drop from the ritual content. Lastly, something that I have come up with for this build that's quite a deviation from Nork the Orc's original plans is a weapon swap setup. So this setup is optimized somewhat for killing bosses. What if we wanted to kill trash better? Well, we're then going to make 3 changes. We're going to change to 2 copies of the weapon Obliteration. We're using this for the mod enemies you kill have a 20% chance to explode, dealing a quarter of their maximum life as chaos damage. Guess what? We're playing a build where that chaos damage can ignite. Now, when that chaos damage ignites, so the enemy explodes, all nearby enemies take a huge chunk of damage and are set on fire. But we want that fire to spread. We don't just want it to be an ember that strikes in a forest and then is immediately extinguished. We want it to become an inferno. And the way that we're going to do that is by swapping off our unset ring, our essence worm ring. We're going to remove that and replace it with Beric's Respite, a unique ring that's quite hard to source. You may not be able to get this for some days in the new league. But when you do, the only reason we're using this is for the line ignites all nearby enemies upon killing an ignited enemy. This actually has a fair bit of range. It's a radius of 23, which is a bit bigger than you might expect for a proliferation effect like this. And this is going to enable you to have 1 or 2 enemies explode with the Obliteration, and then for a massive chain reaction to proliferate through the map basically as fast as you can run. So this is a weapon set. This is a swap that you can use, and the way that you'll be set up is that when you're doing bosses that are easy, or when you're doing maps that have, like where you're mostly fighting trash monsters, you'll use the Obliteration setup. Then when you go to an actual real boss, you're going to swatch over and use your damage scepters and use your essence worm back in again so that you can use the powerful aura malevolence for the bosses. Okay, so that is an outline as to how I'd be looking to build Divine Ire. The next thing that needs to be talked about is the skills we're going to be using. So we've got Flammability on hit from a ring. We have Flame Dash as a primary move skill. We also have Shield Charge available as and this doesn't need to be here. This can be a utility skill. If you like Void Sphere as much as me, maybe you want to use Void Sphere instead. But this is here to proc Fortify. This would require you to use a shield. If you're not using a shield, then and which is a deviation from the build as it stands, then you can't use this, and you should use Void Sphere as your alternative here. Stormbrand in the gloves as well. That's already been mentioned extensively when we were talking about Elemental Equilibrium. Now we have Arcane Cloak. You'll notice this is not turned on. When it's turned on, the damage per second explodes. Arcane Cloak is a buff that's very hard to keep up for any period of time. It will both protect you quite considerably and also add a lot of lightning damage to your spells. It's really good, but it's something that's going to take a bit of playing around with. Nork the Orc suggested stacking the duration of it, and I think that is a very sensible choice. And so I'm going to test it out his way, and then if that works, great. If not, then we'll change it. Second weapon slot, we've got Wave of Conviction set up. This is manually cast and is a source of fire exposure, and also just does a lot of damage to... Oh, sorry, it doesn't really do a lot of damage, but it inflicts that fire exposure, which then causes you to be able to deal more damage with everything else. So you're only going to drop this on big bosses, and then later on, what you want to do is replace one of your scepters with a scepter that has the crafted mod, trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill. This is something that you'll be able to pick up when you are unveiling items for Jun. You'll have a slim chance of getting it each time you unveil a one-handed weapon. I think it might be on two-handers as well. And then eventually you will get access to that craft, and then you can put it onto a scepter. That'll come at an opportunity cost. You can't craft a damage craft at the same time, but it will be worth it. Clarity linked to Enlighten and Empower for maximum oomph, but you won't have Enlighten and Empower early on, so you're just going to start out with it's going to start out with clarity as it is, but you do want to pick these up because it is so difficult to manage your mana with the amount of mana that you're going to be burning with the agnostic. Malevolence adds lots of damage over time. That's really good. Also adds skill effect duration, which I think there's 1 or 2 niche interactions with. And here's Divine Ire. We are going to be linking Divine Ire to Ignite Proliferation. That's the key of the build. And then everything else is a bonus. Deadly Ailments, huge damage multiplier. Burning Damage, huge damage multiplier. Infused Channeling, damage multiplier and a defensive buff. And Swift Affliction is another damage multiplier. So that's basically the setup. If you can only use 5 skill gems, then drop Swift Affliction. If you've only got 4, drop Infused Channeling as well. And your core 4 link will be Divine Ire, Deadly Ailments, Ignite Prolif, and Burning Damage. Okay, in terms of leveling this build, you are probably going to want to level this up to Act 4 as any spellcaster. I personally would go with Arc myself. Pick up Shaper of Flames as your first Ascendancy node. The rest of the Ascendancy can be done in whatever order. As for setting up your passive tree, you're going to want to come out here through these cast speed nodes, grab Heart and Soul, come down this way. And then at this fork, you really got a 3-way fork here. Take the bottom path first, then the left path and the north path can be done in whatever order. Once you get to here, a cluster jewel comes dead last because you're going to need to source some cluster jewels that are worth using. In terms of the cluster jewels that I recommend here, there's a couple of default ones that have been put in when Nork was originally designing his version of the build. These are very, very, very good. Blowback and Cooked Alive, these are going to be hard to source, hard to acquire. You're just going to have to settle for one of those mods with other good things. Blowback is the stronger normally, and I think that's the case with the current setup. Let me just check that. So Cooked Alive is 110,000. Yeah, Blowback is the superior one. So if in doubt, take Blowback plus whatever rubbish fits in on the rest of the jewel, and then look to upgrade to Blowback and Cooked Alive later. In terms of the large cluster jewel, this has Master of Fire and 2 sort of okay mods. Nothing spectacular, so that is very doable early on. You won't necessarily get an exact copy of this, but Master of Fire is really good. The other 2 nodes don't matter so much. Okay, that's all we've really got at the moment. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away. I may not see them in time to answer them usefully because I am going to be going to sleep soon, because it is league start in just 6.5 hours time.